All right. Learning this Sicha, which has been loosely titled the Unity and Separation Sicha, learning about Kilayim. Do you remember Kilayim is the prohibition against mixtures, which each item independently is permitted, but when you mix them together, it becomes forbidden. This falls under the category of what we call chok or chukim, which are statutes, laws that we don't understand at all. Obviously, every mitzvah we do because Hashem told us so, but the other mitzvahs, we could sort of find reasons. We could see something that to us makes sense about why God would command it to us, even though ultimately we don't understand the true reason for the mitzvah. The chukim are ones that does make sense, especially here where you're talking about things that independently are permitted, so all of a sudden only when they're together they're not allowed. What magic thing happened in the mixture that changed everything? The focus that we're looking at is that when you see the verses that speak about this, what we saw originally in Parshas Ki Teitzei, because we also saw it in a different parsha, Parshas Kedoshim, but when we see the verses, it says don't sow other seeds in your vineyard, so don't mix up in your planting. Then it says don't plow with an ox and a donkey together, which is the prohibition against crossbreeding. The prohibition is don't plow with them, but it aligns with the prohibition against crossbreeding. Then it says don't wear a mixture of wool and linen together, which is what we call shatnez. So that's how the Torah says it. That covers the topic of Kilayim. Right after that topic of Kilayim, it doesn't say, oh, by the way, segue, it just switches. All of a sudden it tells you have to make tzitzis and you have to put gedilim. You have to put the fringes, the strings on the four corners. Rashi brings down, based on the Gemara, why are these two verses next to each other? It could have been any topic that came next. These two verses are next to each other to tell us that even if your tzitzis will end up being shatnez, if you're putting linen on wool, wool on linen, whatever it is, even if it ends up being shatnez, then it's still permitted. So you don't just have an exemption, but you got the mitzvah of tzitzis. And then we see also there's a mitzvah for the Kohanim, the required clothing they had to wear for the temple service. And one of those things that they had to wear was an avnet, the belt, and the belt was made out of wool and linen woven together. So we see two examples when it comes to shatnez of exemptions / commandments of mitzvahs that shatnez is allowed. The question that we have is what's different about the garment prohibition of Kilayim versus the other prohibitions that have to do with the ox and the donkey, the crossbreeding one, and then the one that has to do with sowing your field, vineyard, whatever, with different seeds. Why can't you just take a handful of seeds and toss it out? Why does everything have to be planted according to its kind? Then before we started even looking at that, we said, by the way, there's another example of Kilayim, kind of a sister category of Kilayim, which is not mentioned here in these verses. It's something that's mentioned in other places, which is the prohibition against mixing meat and milk together. So obviously we're allowed to have meat, kosher meat, you could have kosher milk, but together it becomes prohibited. And we learn about it from temple service also, that you can't cook a kid its mother's milk, which is the verse that we're going to see here. Again, shatnez has exemptions / commandments for holy service, A, for the priests, the Kohanim and the Beis HaMikdash, B, for tzitzis, and yet none of the other mixtures, none of the other Kilayim have exemptions. That's part of the question that the Sicha is based on, is why does this have exemption and the other don't have exemptions? We looked at it a little bit more, but we're going to see it again now. We read the text last time, so now we're going to go through the actual texts that are referenced, that make up what we read last time. So the prohibition against meat and milk is mentioned multiple times in the Torah. I believe it's 3, and that's 3 prohibitions. You're not allowed to eat it, you're not allowed to cook it, you're not allowed to benefit from it. I can't open up a cheeseburger joint because I'd be benefiting from it, selling it and making money off of it. Here's, for example, this is from Parshas Mishpatim. Sidebar, the last mimer we did, remember Lo Sei Meshakel, is from Parshas Mishpatim. And the Sicha says Parshas Mishpatim. Anyways, so in the Torah it says, Reishish Pikur ad Mascha Tavi Beis Havai Elokecha, Lo Svasha Gedi B'chelev Imo. The choicest of the first fruits of your soil you should bring to the house of Havai Elokecha. That's actually the mitzvah of Bikurim, the mitzvah of bringing the first fruits, brought about Shavuos time. That as soon as you see fruit from the 7 fruits of Israel, the 7 agricultural blessings of Israel, it's not all fruit because wheat and barley, but as soon as you see the first pomegranate growing, you go tie a ribbon around it, and then once it's Shavuos time, you take all the first fruits and you bring them in a basket up to the Beis HaMikdash to thank God for the blessings. That's a sidebar. Put the full verse there so you can have the context of it. Then it says, Lo Savasha Gedi B'chelev Imo, you should not cook a kid in its mother's milk. So this is one of the places where we get the prohibition against mixing meat and milk. This is commentary from the Shalah. It says from Torah Shebechtav. The Shalah Kadosh lived in the 1600s. They call him a mystic. A lot of Chassidus was influenced by his work. So this is in the middle of Tam Basar B'chalav concerning the prohibition of mixing meat and dairy. It's referencing another commentary. The Rekanati writes that the prohibition of milk mixed with meat is part of the Kilayim legislation. The Rebbe is giving over a Sicha, talking about Kilayim. And all of a sudden, it seems that the Rebbe veers off to talk about meat and milk. The Rebbe is saying, per se, I'm not just veering off. Here's proof that it's connected. See, the Shalah is bringing down commentary to show that it's connected. So the Rekanati writes that the prohibition of milk mixed with meat is part of the Kilayim legislation. So there's a commentary that brings it together to say, actually, it falls into this category. It's not just its own kosher category. It's part of the Kilayim. As in, the need to preserve the integrity of the species, such as not sowing seeds of different categories too closely together, not to graft, not to use the beasts of burden of different capacities simultaneously. You see how it talk about the need to preserve the integrity of the species. That's part of what the prohibition of Kilayim is, because if you start grafting, you're creating new species, and if you start crossbreeding, you're creating new species. And that does not preserve the integrity of the species, which eventually we'll see that when Hashem created everything in Bereshis, Hashem created everything and said, that you should be fruitful and multiply, but everything was supposed to be after its kind, as in own kind reproduces of its own kind, not to start crossbreeding and creating new kinds. Funny, someone today was like, well, what about the grapes? They make new wines. It's like, yeah, but it's grapes and grapes. These are not necessarily species. It's not the same as an ox and a donkey, which might be cousins in a way, but they're not the same species. Mixing such species here on Earth results in mixing, matching forces in the celestial regions. See, now we're starting to get a little bit more of an esoteric explanation for why kilayim wouldn't work. Why would be part of the prohibition of kilayim? It's not just a matter of can, you can't, or what it's going to look like. Now we're talking about something even more than that. As everybody remembers so clearly from the Micha the Rebbe Marash, everything has a spiritual source. It's not the first time we spoke about it, but that's one time that we saw it very clearly over and over and over again, that the roots are down here, going up eventually to get to the angel Gabriel, then the attribute of justice, etc., the awakening aspect. Remember all of these things? We saw Ezekiel's chariot, Yechezkel's chariot, that each thing represents a spiritual source in the higher realms. And she'll get to the angels, and even the angels going higher up comes from one of the attributes, the 10 attributes that creates the entire structure of creation. That we've seen many times. So the Shalah is telling us that when you're mixing kilayim, what's the big deal if I just graft two fruit together? What's the big deal if I put an ox and donkey together? What's the big deal to mix stuff together? So what the Shalah is saying, especially here, bring it down for meat and dairy, it's not just a matter of, oops, I made a cheeseburger. That's not just what it is. The Shalah is saying that up above, because everything has a spiritual source, what you're doing now is you're mixing spiritual sources. You're causing a tangle. You're messing stuff up. It's not just, what do we care about the cheeseburger? Who am I affecting? No. There's stuff beyond this world that's going on that's affected by our actions, as we've spoken about many, many times. Meat being red, remember, that's why he says from fire. That's why all those animals have red flesh, because they come from the attribute of gvura, which is strength. Meat being red is symbolic of the attribute of justice, aka gvura, whereas milk being white is symbolic of the attribute of mercy. It's more of a kindness bent. Mixing them would dilute the attribute of mercy. The attribute of justice is then liable to neutralize the attribute of mercy. The Rukhanati expounds on the subject. Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher, we have seen from Rabbeinu Bachya, and then I think we're going to see more from Rabbeinu Bachya, comments very interestingly on what's written on the topic of mixing meat and milk. So we're going to see more from Rabbeinu Bachya, but we're bringing a whole new dimension here right now. That it's not just a matter of, oh, God said keep everything separate. Now the Shalah is bringing in, and you can see the Shalah is even referencing other sources to say it's not just, oh, I put these two together. The Shalah is saying you're mixing stuff up in the esoteric realm. And whatever you're going to mix up in the esoteric realms is going to have impact down here in the physical realm. So if that's not an incentive to keep kosher, don't mix it together, because meat is justice and milk is mercy. And you don't want to mix it together so you don't dilute the attribute of mercy. As we have said many times before, we're not just here. Things are not just the face value, what we see in the physical realm. There's so much more going on in the spiritual realm that we impact down here in this world. Now we can see that Kalayim is not so simple to just say don't mix it. This is from the Gemara of Nazir. There's actually a few Gemaras that reference a similar point. Because of all the different discussions, certain other discussions will come up in more than one place in the Gemara, and sometimes it's described with a little bit more, a little bit less detail. Here we're going to see it's talking about prohibition against milk and meat. So we're going to see more on it because that's the topic that we introduced in this section. It's in the middle of a discussion, so some of this might not all entirely make sense. It's in the middle of a discussion which has to do about the Nazir. The Nazir is a Nazirite. That's someone who vowed not to cut his hair, not to consume any grape products. So you can't even have grape skin, raisins, wine, any of that kind of stuff for X amount of time. So for example, since Samson was a Nazir, he was actually a Nazir from the womb, that he wasn't allowed to cut his hair or anything like that. That's part of how Delilah gets it, because she finally finds out what is the source of your strength, and he admits that is his hair. She tangles the hair, she cuts the hair, whatever, and that's how they're finally able to capture him. Samuel the prophet was a Nazir from birth, so never cut his hair in his life. And then in temple times, you would have somebody who's trying to, or whatever sort of refinement process they had to go through, they could be a Nazir for a certain amount of time. It wasn't necessarily a lifelong thing. Someone could have been a Nazir for a specific time frame. There's several laws around that. This topic of milk and meat comes up within the topic of the Gemara, where the Gemara is talking about the laws of the Nazir. So one of the sages said to Abaye, a very great sage, when Rabbi Yochanan said that the principle of permitted food combined with forbidden food is derived from the term soaked, he spoke in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Okay, what do we mean by that? We're talking about things that are forbidden, permitted, etc. So if a Nazir would take his bread and dip it in wine versus soaking it in wine versus waved it past the wine, different things like that. And what it's actually going to relate to is the whole thing of meat and milk. It says don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. So what if I just kind of rub them together? Is that still allowed? So we're just looking at what the discussion is. Obviously we can't do that, we don't do that, but here's just, you can see how the discussion comes up. We're on such a journey of the oral law. Okay, so referencing Rabbi Akiva now. The Gemara asks, to which statement of Rabbi Akiva is the Gemara referring? If we say it is referring to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva of this Mishnah, as we learned in Shavuot, so referencing another Gemara, the Rabbi Akiva says, even if a Nazirite, so a Nazir, soaked his bread in wine, and the bread and the wine contain enough to combine to constitute an olive bulk, he is liable. As in, when it says this is prohibited, this mixing is prohibited, to what extent are we talking about? Only the size of an olive, that's still prohibited, he can't do that. The Nazir can't have any grape products. But from where do we know that Rabbi Akiva means an olive bulk taken from the bread and the wine together? Perhaps that ruling applies only when there's an olive bulk of wine as it is without the bread. This thing of an olive bulk is called kazayas. It's a measurement that's used in Torah. For example, if you've eaten in a kazayas, do I need a bench? Do I need to say a bracha? It's a measurement that's used. So here they're saying, how do you know that it becomes like an olive together? Maybe it's just if the bread is an olive size, but there's only a dot of wine, or if it's just an olive amount of wine and just a dot of bread. Is it together, separate, etc.? All this is just the context that brings us into the milk and meat. And if you would say in that case, what is the purpose of stating this ruling? What is the novelty of Rabbi Akiva's statement? If the mixture contains an olive bulk of wine, kazayas, one could say that it serves to exclude the opinion of the first Tana, who said that it's liable only if he drinks a quarter log of wine. So it's talking about a different measurement. Rabbi Akiva emphasizes the one is liable even if he drinks the amount of an olive bulk. Okay, so it's a tiny amount being mixed together, then it's liable. Rabbi, the references to the following statement of Rabbi Akiva in a Breita. So that's an outside teaching. As it is taught in Breita, the Rabbi Akiva says, a Nazir who soaked his bread in wine and ate an olive bulk, kazayas. A mixture of bread and wine is liable. This Breita indicates that according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, a permitted substance combined with a forbidden substance. Rav Acha, son of Rav Avia, said to Rav Ashi, according to Rabbi Akiva, who establishes the verse, neither shall he drink anything soaked, going to Parshas Bamidbar where it talks about this, as referring to the principle that the permitted combines with the forbidden, from where does it derive the principle that the legal status of the flavor is like that of the substance itself? If it's just enough to impart flavor, it becomes a forbidden thing. The Gemara answers, he derived this principle from the prohibition of meat cooked in milk. There we go, now we got to where we're going. Is it not the case that there is no actual milk present, and it is merely taste of the milk absorbed in the meat, and yet the mixture is prohibited? Here too, in the case of other prohibitions, it is no different, and the legal status of the flavor is like that of the substance itself. So what if I didn't cook the meat in the milk, but somehow I soaked it to impart the flavor? Is that still considered prohibited? Spoiler alert, we don't do that. The Gemara asks with regard to the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Akiva and derive the halacha that the legal status of the flavor is like that of the substance itself. From the phrase, neither shall he drink anything soaked, why do they not derive this principle from the case of meat cooked in milk? So Rabbi Akiva gets it from meat and milk. They say, no, that's not where the principle comes from. The Gemara answers, the rabbis claim that we do not derive other prohibitions from meat cooked in milk, as that prohibition is a novelty, and one does not learn halachot from unusual cases. All that's going through here about what size does it have to be, etc., ultimately, you see other halachot get affected by this, because we're trying to establish principles. We have to establish principles of law, because if someone has a question, well, what about this? So we have to go back to the principles to see how we apply it. Is there precedent for these kinds of things, etc.? All this discussion, all this technicality is to establish what the law is, to establish the principles of law so we can end up answering for years and years to come. You're still studying Gemara today because obviously the Torah is relevant all times and all places, and also because they're establishing the principles that we still use today in halachic rulings. Understanding how things are categorized and how things are viewed is all relevant for everything that we're doing today. The Gemara asks, what is the novelty of that prohibition? Why is meat and milk considered a novelty? If we say that it's unique in that this meat alone and that milk alone are each permitted, yet together they're forbidden, that characteristic is not unique to meat cooked in milk. In the case of forbidden mixtures of diverse kinds too, this element alone and that element alone are each permitted, and yet together they're forbidden. So here we see our first correlation between meat and milk and the rest of the kalayim, because each thing individually permitted, but together forbidden. Versus, by the way, the example that I brought in the Nazir, the bread is permitted, but the wine is forbidden. So that's how they're trying to figure out at which point, if you soak the bread in wine, does it become prohibited. You could see here that we're referencing the Gemara. We're showing you the chain of how we got to where we are now. The Gemara answers, rather the novelty is that if one soaks meat in milk all day, it is permitted by Torah law. Torah law, not rabbinic law, by Torah law. Despite the fact that the meat certainly absorbs some taste of the milk, whereas if one cooked meat in milk, even for a short time, the mixture is forbidden by Torah law. The novelty is that it is not the fact that they are mixed together that renders meat and milk forbidden, but the act of cooking. I think that's why I added that all in. Just to show you guys how Torah law establishes one thing, then the rabbinic law extrapolates from there. There's a whole thing of kosher. A lot of the laws of kosher are contingent upon what transfers taste. Rabbi give the example. It's not all about that base, it's all about that taste. I didn't remember where he said he got it from. It's all about the taste. So much of kosher law has to do with taste transference. So for example, you have the idea like if you're cutting an onion, let's say, which is a sharp food item, with a dairy knife versus a meat knife, sharpness transfers taste. So if I cut the onion with a meat knife, I'm making that onion now a meat onion. So it's not like, oh, I have to wait 6 hours after I eat it, but I should only then use it for meat products. I should not then use it for milk products. There are other things. If a tiny little bit of milk falls into my massive pot of chicken soup, do I have to toss the whole pot or not? So it depends. Is it really a tiny amount when there's not a taste transference then? We talk about establishing principles, etc. We have statements, then we have to keep extrapolating. We have to keep discussing and breaking it down and figuring out what is actually being said here and what is it actually referring to so we can actually understand what our halacha is supposed to be. You can see a little bit now about how the oral law is working. So this leads us to the conclusion that it would have been possible to think that mixing milk and meat is permitted for sacrifices had the Torah not explicitly prohibited it. Because this whole idea of the kalayim, I'm bring this animal as a sacrifice. God, for sure, wants some butter on his sacrifice, on his steak. Why can't I do that for God? If I'm bringing a sacrifice to God, we got to top chef this. So why would I not do that? And here it's saying, no, actually, it is prohibited because the Torah tells us it's prohibited. God does not want this for his sacrifices. This is from the Gemara of Chulin. It's actually referencing the Mishnah, and then it's going to explain it. Mishnah, it is prohibited to cook any meat of domesticated and undomesticated animals and birds and milk, except for the meat of fish and grasshoppers, whose halachic status is not that of meat. There are two kinds of grasshoppers that are kosher. We don't officially know which ones they are anymore, but there are communities, very few communities, that claim to still know which those grasshoppers are. So if you're in those communities, you can have the grasshoppers, but the rest of us don't eat it. The Torah gives descriptions for what kosher grasshoppers look like. So it's like, well, what is it? But we don't eat them anymore. It's actually interesting that the Mishnah, the Gemara is bringing down from the Mishnah, that cooking meat in milk, we know is a direct prohibition, but fish and grasshoppers are not meat. So technically you should be able to cook it in milk. There's a whole idea also about poultry is not meat either. In theory, you should be able to have chicken parmesan, whatever, all the other recipes with it. But because it is so close to meat, it's something that became a rabbinic prohibition. So there shouldn't be confusion about the foods. And likewise, the sages issued a decree that is prohibited to place any meat together with milk products. Example, cheese on one table. It's not just a matter that you can't cook them together. We see that the sages extended the prohibition. Don't put them both on the same table. The reason for this prohibition is that one might come to eat them after they absorb substances from each other. This prohibition applies to all types of meat except for the meat of fish and grasshoppers, as we said from the beginning. Okay, more Gemara, Tamura. Rabbi Elazar says an animal crossbred from diverse kinds, and a treifa, and an animal born by caesarean section, and a tumtum animal, and a hermaphrodite animal are not sacred through consecration, and if they were sacred before, and e.g. one consecrated animal, and it subsequently became a treifa, they do not sanctify non-sacred animals by means of substitution. We're extending the idea of kilayim. What we already learned about the kilayim is that crossbreeding, mixing stuff up, changes stuff on high. The idea of kilayim is that you're creating a new mixture out of two things that are permitted. Here we're looking at animals that, because for whatever reason, whatever happened to them, they don't look like a regular animal. See, hermaphrodite is called androgynous. So treif is any animal that's been rendered not kosher. Rambam's going to explain. This is Rambam, Hilchos Isuri Mizbeach. These are the prohibitions for sacrifice on altar. Similarly, a hybrid animal, one born through caesarean section and one that is lacking in age, are unacceptable even if they're unblemished. We saw this in the Avos Yisrael Mimer. That something that has a blemish that is not complete cannot be a sacrifice before God. So someone who doesn't have Avos Yisrael, you're rejecting a part of yourself, and rejecting a part of yourself means that you are not complete before God. So you're going to come to daven. How can you come to submit yourself before God? You're not complete. The Rambam, we're in the middle of a discussion here of what animals could come on a mizbeach. What could be brought as a sacrifice? So we already know that an animal can't have a blemish to it. It can't have some permanent physical damage to it. Now the Rambam is telling us that there's more to that category, that it's any animal that's not perfect even through birth. That there's something not natural to that animal is not allowed to be brought as a sacrifice, because the sacrifice has to be wholly perfect in all kind of ways. These are all excluded through the exegesis of Vayikra, an ox, a lamb, and a goat, etc. Shor or cheves or ace. This implies each of the species must be separate. An animal should not be a hybrid between a lamb and a goat. That goes back to the Kalayim. When it gives birth, Kiyavale, this is part of the original verse that we see. This excludes one born through caesarean section. It will be 7 days. This excludes one that's lacking in age. How old is it? We don't know. Vayashivas Yamim. This excludes one that's lacking in age. Together with its mother, Tachasimo. This excludes an orphan, i.e. an animal born after its mother was slaughtered. All of these are not fit for the Mizbeach. Let's look at the verse of Vayikra. Because of all the specifications that are given in that verse, Rambam is now drawing out from each of these specifications animals that are not allowed on the Mizbeach. An animal which looks like a different species is unacceptable as a sacrifice for the Mizbeach, even though it is not a hybrid, as in it's not a crossbred. What is implied? A ewe gave birth to an animal that resembled a goat, or a she-goat gave birth to an animal that resembled a lamb. Even though it has some of the signs of its own species, it is unacceptable like an animal that has a permanent blemish. For there is no blemish greater than a change in appearance, as in something that doesn't look like what it's supposed to look like. So the Rambam says that all of these are considered a type of blemish that would make it unfit for the Mizbeach. So that would definitely apply to a crossbred animal. For example, a mule is not a horse and it's not a donkey. So that's definitely forbidden. We're seeing now how the extension of the prohibitions and how they're applying, how the category ends up umbrellaing. So again, seeing the oral law play out, you have the Torah which was given, the Torah precedes creation, but it was given to us 2448. We didn't see the Mishnah. You see the Gemara comes in. The Gemara comes in over 1,000 years later to give us explanation of all these things. And then Rambam's coming in hundreds of years after that. All these other sages coming in centuries later to explain more, expound more upon all these topics. Till you get to where we are today and with the laws that still apply to us now. All these kalayim still apply. This brings us to Tanya. Tanya chapter 37. The statement of the sages. The God desired an abode in lower realms refers to our physical world, the lowest in regard to the degree of revelation of divine creative power, hidden in this world as in no other. Remember, we've spoken about a lot of times how to know that this world is the point of all creation, because God stopped when he created this world. So the higher worlds are just a means to getting to us in the lowest world. Even though we're the coarsest, the most physical, we are the purpose of creation. God desired precisely this world, pervaded with doubled and redoubled darkness as his abode, to be the home for him, as in to reveal himself fully. His essence would be revealed in this world, where his presence would ultimately be revealed to a greater degree than in the higher worlds without any concealing garments whatsoever. Eventually, Hashem will be more revealed in this world than he is even revealed in the much higher realms. This will be the Messianic era, the period for which the world was originally created, when godliness will be manifest throughout the world and all nations on earth will experience divine revelation. Amen. Mashiach is for everybody and we will all know God then. Now, this ultimate perfection of the Messianic era, at the time of the resurrection of the dead, meaning the revelation of the Ein Sof light in this physical world, Ein Sof means without end, is dependent on our actions of divine service throughout the period of exile, unlike the aforementioned revelation at Sinai, which was initiated by God. So, now that we left Egypt, as everybody remembers clearly the mimers that we learned about leaving Egypt and the splitting of the sea and terrestrial life and sea and marine life and the thing of limitations, we have to go beyond our limitations, but we're still going to remember the Exodus when Mashiach comes. We're going to say, remember what it was like when we had challenges and we had to overcome them, etc., etc., etc. We got to experience what marine life is, that creatures who live within their source, but we're maintaining our identities as terrestrial creatures who live separate from their source. All that leads up to the getting of the Torah on Har Sinai, which were massive revelations. And as you remember, we haven't learned the Sicha about what changed at Har Sinai is that we had the fusion. Avram ushered us into that era, different from the era before that of Adam and Noach, etc. The fusion is that now when you do a mitzvah, the physical world will retain the holiness. That goes back to the mimer that we learned about crossing the sea. Why did we cross the sea if all we did is boomerang back onto the same shore? Because we had to experience revelations, etc. And because we're going to get the Torah, and so we had to go through the iron crucible of the slavery in Egypt to prepare us and the world, us to be the light bringers and the world to be the receiver of that light that we'll bring into it. Only at Har Sinai did God annul a decree that kept heaven and earth separate and say, now heaven and earth can meet. As in, there are things within the physical world that can retain holiness. So eventually the whole world will be revealed as a godly place. So, what are we getting at? The whole thing of Sinai, getting the Torah to Har Sinai, God initiated that. God made it all come about, even with us saying Nasa v'nishma, still all from God. God comes down first, etc. Remember, new bracket, new sidebar. Unlike Purim, which you remember, the mimer that we learned, V'kibel HaYehudu, what is so significant about Purim is that we fully accepted upon ourselves then that we will keep the Torah fully, not like God holding the mountain over us or anything like that. We decide on our own. That's why Purim is such a special holiday. Even when Mashiach comes, it's still going to have an elevated status among all the holiness. Now, what are we saying? Sinai, taking us out of Egypt, the plagues, etc., all the way till giving the Torah on Har Sinai, that God initiated all of it, which is part of why, another sidebar, the whole thing of the golden calf, how could that happen? Because Har Sinai, even though it was such a great moment, it wasn't coming from us, so it's not as lasting. When it's not your own work, when it's not your own initiative, it doesn't impact you the same way as when someone impresses it upon you. That's outside inspiration versus something that you initiate on your own. So on the one end, when it's outside, it could be something greater, the revelations of Mount Sinai. But when it comes to me, that's much different, because it's mine then, and mine makes it more lasting. It becomes more permanent then, which again goes back to Purim. The Messianic era, the world being brought to a Messianic state, that is our work. That is what we have to do in this world. We're the ones who have to initiate. We're the ones who have to make it happen. We can't rely on God, just, okay, boom, now it's a home for me. No. Us doing the Torah mitzvahs. That's what's going to make it the home for Hashem. And all that's going to happen later is contingent upon our actions now. For it is the mitzvah itself that causes, i.e. creates its reward. And this is the Rebbe, as in our Rebbe, inserting a note here about the Tanya. Unlike, for example, the wages paid by the owner of a field to the laborer who plows and plants in it, where the laborer does not create the money he has paid, a mitzvah actually creates its own reward. The reward of mitzvah itself, so it's commensurate with the mitzvah itself, versus the fact that you're giving somebody a salary, you're giving somebody money, it's just something the market's determined. It's not a real outcome of the work that they've done. By performing the mitzvah, a man draws the revelation of the blessed Ein Sof light from above downward to be clothed in the physicality of this world, i.e. in an object which had heretofore been under the dominion of Klipat Noga. Klipat Noga is the gray zone. Klipa is the shell. Is this a good orange or not? It depends. You got to open the shell to find out. A gray zone, is it black or white? As in, is it holy or not holy? Is it the other side, Sitra Achar? Well, it depends on how we use it. We could extract the holiness from it and turn it to something holy or not. And had received its vitality from this klipa, namely all pure permissible objects with which the act of the mitzvah is performed. So that which is permitted, but not specifically holy, is something that we can make holy when we use it for a mitzvah. And this is how we bring about the dwelling place for God. This is how we bring about the Messianic era. So everything that's permitted, you could do a mitzvah with it. Everything that's prohibited, it's prohibited because you can't do a mitzvah with it. So it's not just God making rules for funsies. It's no, this cannot be elevated. Don't go there. This is all permitted. That means that you could elevate it. Everything that's allowed in this world, how can you use it in a holy way? For example, the parchment of the tefillin, mezuzah, and sefer Torah, which must be made of the skins of permissible kosher animals. So sages state for the work of heaven, i.e. mitzvah object, only that which is pure and permissible to eat may be used. Similarly, an etrog, which is not orla, the forbidden fruit of a tree's first 3 harvests. Even an etrog that you're going to be using to say the blessing on, you have to make sure it's not orla, which is prohibited. A note on this idea of what's called orla. Orla is still practiced, by the way. If you plant a fruit tree, you can't eat for the first 3 years of the fruit tree because it's Orla and that's prohibited. For Orla is of the 3 completely unclean klipot that can never ascend into holiness. That's what we call Sitra Achra. Prohibited because you cannot elevate it. As written in Eitz Chaim, thus fruit which is Orla, deriving its vitality from these klipot, as in it's coming from these negative forces, cannot be elevated by having a mitzvah performed with it. And similarly, any mitzvah's performance involved a transgression, God forbid. So you actually cannot steal from the rich to give to the poor because you have stolen. And when you have stolen, then that money cannot become charity. You cannot take not kosher food and say, I will now have my Shabbos meal, and it's going to be an elevated meal because it's for Shabbos. No, it's not kosher. It's not elevated. Since the sinful act receives its vitality from the 3 completely unclean klipot, the resulting mitzvah cannot elevate it. That's the whole idea of prohibited, is that a mitzvah cannot elevate it, versus things which are permitted. A mitzvah can elevate it. That is literally what the definition of permitted and prohibited. If you remember all the way back when we learned in Tanya, it's bound or unbound. So if it's unbound, it can be elevated. If it's bound, it can't be elevated. Mutter and asur. There's your note on Orla, etc., etc. Similarly, an etrog, which is on Orla, or money given to charity that has not been acquired through theft and their like, i.e. other physical objects used in performing a mitzvah, all of which were previously in the realm of klipat nogar and are now merged into the divine will by serving the purpose of a mitzvah. When performed with pure and permissible objects, the mitzvah elevates those objects from klipat nogar to holiness to be united with the Ein Sof, as we have learned many, many times before. Now that one fulfills God's commandment and will with these objects, as in you're doing a mitzvah, the vitality within them ascends, the godly life force that's in them is going to be elevated and is dissolved and absorbed into the blessed Ein Sof light, or Ein Sof Baruch Hu, which is his will that is clothed in the mitzvah, the divine will that each mitzvah represents. For in a mitzvah, there's no concealment of the countenance whatsoever to hide his light, preventing the object from being absorbed in this light. When you do a mitzvah with something, the godly life force that animates it is going to be wholly united with its source, because in the face of a mitzvah, nothing can block it, because it is such a holy situation. Wherever the Ein Sof light is revealed, there is no separation from God. Everything is united with his light. In this case, the object with which the mitzvah, representing revelation of the will and light of the Ein Sof, is performed. Where there is revelation, there's no separation from godliness. A Jew's animal soul, like the aforementioned objects, derives its vitality from klipa noga, and like them, it experiences a similar elevation to the realm of holiness whenever it is used in the service of a mitzvah, being absorbed into the divine will represented by the mitzvah. The reason why we just sidebar into Tanya over here is because we're talking about the idea about things that are prohibited cannot be used for a mitzvah. Kilayim, the whole idea of kilayim, because it's prohibited, you can't then use it for a mitzvah, which is kind of part of what our emphasis of the Sicha is. So why are tzitzis and the clothing of the kohanim allowed? But we're seeing here, we would have thought perhaps when it comes to basar b'chalav, meat and milk, that this would be permitted, but no, the verse tells us not, right? Building on the idea, and then the Rambam brings in Kilayim when he's talking about the whole idea of, once we got into the whole discussion of animals and which things you can mix and not, etc., then we got to the whole idea of the animals that don't look like themselves. That's not allowed either. It's not just saying, no, you're not allowed to. It's because literally that which is prohibited is that which cannot be elevated for a mitzvah. Now, finishing off, we ended up with 3 subdivisions of Kilayim. One for garments, which is shatnez. The Torah permits, even instructs to use for service in the base of Mikdash and the mitzvah of tzitzis. Meat and milk, which now we learned is part of the Kilayim. We didn't know that because it's not in the original verse. We recognize the properties are the same, things that individually are permitted but together, mixed together, is prohibited. We thought maybe it would be permitted for sacrifices, but instead we derived the prohibition from a verse. The verse of the Torah tells us explicitly, no, it's not allowed, because we didn't create a new substance out of it. It seems like we didn't create a new substance out of it. It's not the same as creating a new species of something. Then we have land and animals, sewing things together, grafting, etc., and crossbreeding, not plowing with 2 opposite animals together. We never even had a thought to permit it, even for holy reasons, so we didn't need a verse to teach this. We said that is obviously Kilayim because we've created a new species out of it. Versus meat and milk and the garments will and lin together, we haven't created a new species, but it's a mixture that God has prohibited. As all these prohibitions are based on the same principle of Kilayim, mixing 2 things which are independently permitted, but the mixture is prohibited, why the difference in exceptions for service in the base of Mikdash and other mitzvot, like tzitzis? That's the question that this section leads off on. Cliffhanger. Well, you'll see in the next sections there's going to be much more text because we set up a question, we expanded the question by introducing a new topic that actually strengthened the question, and then we're going to start explaining everything so we can eventually come to an answer for why things are the way they are, as far as we can understand it.